that in mind. There are a number of arguments that keep being raised, primarily about the proof of citizenship requirements within the Save America Act. I would note here that in the citizenship component of the Save America Act, there are two basic components within that. One component deals with the obligation of the registering voter at the time of voter registration. And the other imposes obligations on state governments to coordinate and share information and data with the federal government as they undertake regular reviews of state voter registration files, just to make sure that people who are registered to vote are in fact United States citizens. Why is that necessary? Well, currently there are a whole lot of states, and they tend to be states that might colloquially be described as blue, meaning that they're run by Democratic governors and or have Democratic dominated state legislatures, that are refusing to cooperate, to coordinate, to share data with the Department of Homeland Security and the entities within the Department of Homeland Security responsible for maintaining the SAVE database, an already existing database designed to help identify issues like this, like non-citizens who may have crept into voter registration files and get rid of them. But with all those blue states refusing to cooperate, to coordinate, to enter into memoranda of understanding pertaining to the sharing of information and data, it's a really vexing problem because it raises all kinds of concerns. How are we supposed to know when the law is violated, when a non-citizen has registered to vote, if the federal government, which is ultimately the piece within our government system that has the records and the ability to ascertain citizenship? How are you ever going to expect that we can ensure that our laws prohibiting non-citizen voting in U.S. elections, are being complied with? Now, a few minutes ago, my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from New Mexico, made an argument on this point. He made a parallel reference by analogy to what might happen if somebody were saying, we don't need additional laws confirming that it's against the law to run a stop sign if it's already against the law, and saying that this is akin to passing another law making doubly sure that people don't run stop signs. Well, I understand the point, but it would be a fair argument, or at least a fairer argument, if the argument went something like this. If, in his hypothetical, there were a system in place that legally and practically prevented police from monitoring traffic activity at intersections guarded by a stop sign, then yeah, that might be a fair parallel reference. Because that's exactly what we're dealing with the status quo under a 1993 law called the NVRA, a law that 20 years after its enactment was interpreted by the Supreme Court, wrongly but conclusively, and that ruling remains in effect to this very day, concluding that the state governments are prohibited, even where they suspect a registering voter is a non-citizen. They may not do anything to follow up on that person's citizenship. They may not request any proof of that person's citizenship, even if they believe that it is suspect or lacking. So that makes it analogous to this hypothetical of a supplemental law that would require, or at least allow, observation of the intersection guarded by a stop sign. If he's going to make that analogy, then that's how you make it fair, because that's essentially what's happening. That is directly analogous to what's happening here. It's as though we have laws saying you may not run a stop sign, but state and local police are prohibited from observing traffic at any intersection guarded by a stop sign and may not issue traffic tickets, even if they believe those things might be occurring, because they're not allowed to watch that intersection. That's what's going on here. But it's even worse than that, because their own state governments are contributing to the violation of the laws, to ignoring it, because they refuse to share information. They refuse to hand over their data. This is especially troubling for so many reasons, Mr. President, including and especially the fact that in a handful of states, I believe it's 4 or 5 jurisdictions, maybe 4 states and the District of Columbia, they allow non-citizen voting in some of their local elections. Now, I don't know why any jurisdiction would want to allow this. I don't know why any state would want to allow any local election within that state to include non-citizen voting, but if their state laws and their state constitution contain nothing to prohibit that, then that is their choice, because there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution or in federal law that would prohibit them from doing that. Nonetheless, once they do that, it raises all kinds of questions that really do need to be addressed. For example, if they're voting, if you've got non-citizens legally voting in some local elections in 4 or 5 states and the District of Columbia, then that means they are registering to vote. They have voter registration files. When those states are asked, what are you doing with those voter registration files to make sure that they're not cross-pollinating, that the same registered voters who are non-citizens are not also participating in federal elections? And they're not sharing their information. They're not answering that question, which is a really, really important question. And their refusal to answer that question or to share data makes the need for this even more pressing. Now, when we look at all of this, one of the many arguments that the Democrats appear to be raising over and over again, there are 2 of them that are especially common that I think need to be addressed head-on here. One of the arguments raised over and over again is that if we require registering voters to provide at the time of voter registration proof of citizenship, then that is necessarily going to disenfranchise a lot of people. Now, one number they throw around is something like 21 million Americans will be disenfranchised, will be unable to vote. Well, that by itself is not true. It's not supported. This is based on some studies indicating that based on surveys, they extrapolate that there are about 21 million Americans who don't necessarily have that requisite documentation, or they don't know where it is at the moment, or something to that effect. Remember, by the way, any and every time any American citizen takes a new job, starts a new job as an employee for a new employer on American soil or anywhere within the jurisdiction of the United States, they have to fill out an I-9 form. And the I-9 form requires them to provide, before they may start that job, proof of U.S. citizenship, either supplied by a U.S. passport establishing U.S. citizenship, or alternatively, an original certified birth certificate accompanied by a government-issued photo ID and or an original Social Security card. If you don't have those things, you can't start the job unless or until you can provide that documentation. Now, those things would suffice under the Save America Act, voter registration provisions requiring proof of citizenship. But that's not all that would suffice. We wanted to make it as flexible as it could possibly be, lest there be any credible argument that this would impose an undue hardship, an undue burden. One could argue, of course, that even just requiring the same documentation that every American has to provide whenever they start a new job would be fair, and maybe it would be. But we wanted to make it even easier to comply with that. We want to encourage those who are U.S. citizens to be able to vote. If you can legally vote, you should, and you shouldn't have these impediments. So we added a list of other documents that you could use. Certain other ID cards that have been established and recognized within the United States government as establishing citizenship could do it. And then we provided a catch-all that not one of my Democrat colleagues has even acknowledged, even though they've been in the room when I've raised the argument, when I've cited it, when I've noted what it does. Some of the people hearing the argument over and over and over again still refuse even to acknowledge that it exists when they claim that unless you have a U.S. passport, you're going to be disenfranchised. And then some of them will say a passport will cost a couple $100, so this is a poll tax, it's expensive, it's going to disenfranchise all of these people. But they ignore this provision. The provision begins on the text starting at line 22 on page 12 of the Save America Act as passed by the House of Representatives, which is the legislation pending before us and that we're now debating. They ignore this every single time. They ignore it over and over and over again, to the point of being not only disingenuous, but dishonest. These are, in fact, dishonest arguments because they overlook that. This doesn't disenfranchise anyone. You need not shell out a nickel, a dime, a quarter, not even a penny or a fraction of a penny. You need not spend anything. You need not waste any time digging through old piles of documents if you can't find them. And if you never had those documents to begin with, or your house burnt down, or your dog ate them, or whatever, not a problem. Why? Well, because we've allowed them by a simple affidavit to provide an attestation. There's a personal narrative of, here is why I'm a citizen, either based on the fact that I was born in such and such a city in the United States on such and such a date, or I was not born a U.S. citizen, but I was later naturalized. Here's where I was born. Here's when I was naturalized. Here's the path I took to naturalization. Either way, once you submit that, and that could be in the brief paragraph, maybe a few sentences describing those critical facts, you hand it over to the state election official, and the burden then shifts to the state to confirm or refute. And unless they can refute the facts that you allege, you are a registered voter, and there's no need for you to worry about it. So this is absolute nonsense to say that you'll be disenfranchised if you don't have your documents or you can't afford a passport or whatever it is. This is just an absolute, total lie. And so, look, in these more serene moments within the United States Senate, when things seem calm, and they are in some respects calm, it's not a time for us to assume that the arguments aren't real, that they aren't being made aggressively. This is not a time for drinking a pina colada. This is not a time for ignoring the endogenous and exogenous pressures that we face from every direction. Speaking of endogenous pressures, I see the presence of my friend and distinguished colleague, the great senator from the state of Kansas. And he's got a message for us, and I'm going to interrupt my remarks and yield, with the permission of the chair, to Senator Marshall until the conclusion of his remarks, when I will continue mine.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you. Thank you to my colleague from Utah as well and his great leadership on this. Mr. President, last night we had a moment of clarity in this chamber. Senate Democrats were given the simplest possible test, a clean, standalone vote on voter ID. Nothing attached, nothing complicated, just one question. Do you believe only American citizens with a valid ID should decide American elections? With nowhere to hide, they voted it down. And in doing so, they told every American exactly where they stand. Now, I understand their concerns about the provisions in the SAVE Act, the proof of citizenship, and stronger guardrails around absentee ballots, and those deserve honest debate. But there's simply no excuse for rejecting basic voter identification when 70% of Democrats, their own voters, the people who sent them here, support it. 70% of Democrats support voter ID. Now, this vote was very clarifying. It was unmasking. I want everyone at home tonight enjoying March Madness to think about your situation personally for a moment. You know what it's like to vote. You leave work, you go and vote, you stand in line, you fill out your ballot, you drive home, you're late for dinner. You did everything right, but on that way home you think to yourself, oh my gosh, somewhere out there, someone with no legal right to vote canceled my vote. My vote's gone, neutralized, like it never happened. Now that should make every American angry, regardless of your party. And I think it's important to stop and think why people are concerned about this, what we're actually dealing with here. There are 50 million non-citizens living in this country. 50 million non-citizens living in this country. Some are legal, some are illegal, out of 330 million. And we have 4 states that are automatically registering people to vote when they interact with government services. Let me say it again. 4 states are automatically registering people to vote regardless of their citizenship or not when they interact with government services. And we have no reliable national system to verify citizenship at the ballot box. And that's not fear-mongering. That's just the truth. And maybe that's why 80% of Americans support voter ID. We can't get 80% of Americans to agree on whether hamburger is better than chicken, is peanut butter better than jelly. But 80% of Americans support voter ID. It just makes common sense. And like I said earlier, 70% of Democrats agree with them as well. Now, as I sat and listened to the arguments on the floor last night, we saw Democrats dodging and weaving like Muhammad Ali at the Thrilla in Manila, never once addressing voter ID itself. It was amazing to sit here and watch them squirm and refusing to answer the question at hand. Do they support voter ID or not? So I had to pause. And we had plenty of time to think this weekend and ask a fundamental question. One of those questions we didn't get to talk about much in med school. But the question I asked myself, what actually sustains a republic? What are we really fighting for? Well, I think number one at the top of this is safe and secure elections. And these aren't a Republican issue. They're not a conservative talking point. They're the beating heart of democracy itself. So last night, I sat down and penciled out what I believe are at least 7 of the sacred pillars that uphold our entire system of self-government. And if I could, I'd like to walk through them. Because when any one of these pillars is weakened, the whole temple of liberty trembles. Now, first and foremost, free and fair elections. The sacred cornerstone of our republic. Safe, secure, honest elections defended by integrity, universal suffrage, the secret ballot, and the peaceful transfer of power. This is the voice of the people itself. Without it, democracy does not stumble, it dies. Next, the rule of law. The unyielding bedrock of equality under justice. No person, no party, no elite stands above the law. Lose the single pillar and every other freedom collapses. Next, separation of powers with checks and balances, and we see that every day up here. The masterful architecture of liberty itself, forged by genius to chain ambition and prevent any single branch from devouring our freedoms. Next, an independent and impartial judiciary, the fearless bulwark of due process and constitutional fidelity, the final guardian of justice, protecting the weak, the innocent, and the Constitution against the storms of fleeting majorities. Next, the protection of fundamental rights and civil liberties, including free speech, free press, assembly, association, religion. These are sacred, God-given, and must burn undimmed forever. Next, the sanctity of private property, the moral and economic foundation of human dignity. And finally, a political pluralism, transparency, accountability, and active citizenship participation. Mr. President, election integrity is not just one of these pillars. It's the foundation beneath all of them. Every debate in this chamber, every vote, every piece of legislation, all of it rests on the assumption that the people in these seats were put here legitimately by the voters of their states. And I cannot get past the simple fact in this country. We have collectively decided you need a photo ID to board a plane. Remember, trust but verify. I walk up to the plane, they all know I'm Senator Roger Marshall, but they make me verify who I am. When you check into a hotel, you buy certain medications, you open a bank account, you pick up a prescription, you apply for government benefits. You have to show an ID. But your vote, the single most important thing you do as a citizen, we're told that asking for an ID is somehow voter oppression, which certainly has not been proven to be true in the multiple states that already have voter ID. Again, it doesn't make sense. The American people don't know it doesn't make sense, and that's why 80% of them support voter ID. Now, I'm willing to come to the table. There are parts of this bill that we can work out. I'm not asking anyone to take it or leave it, but first answer the premise of this entire debate. We don't get anywhere if you won't recognize the importance of voter ID. So here's the question. Do you believe only American citizens should decide American elections? I'm going to say it again. Do you believe only American citizens should decide American elections? Because until we get a straight answer to that, nothing else matters. What gives us the best chance right now is getting 10 Democrats to come across the aisle and do the right thing. And again, if 70% of their own voters support voter ID, you would think 10 Senate Democrats would do the same thing. That somewhere in that caucus are 10 senators willing to listen to the people who sent them here. If we can get just 10 of them to stand with us, to stand with their own constituents on this one thing, then let's keep talking. Let's work out the rest together. So I'm going to say it a third time, a fourth time. I have no regrets in saying it again. Last night, Senate Democrats voted against voter ID. Now, I've only heard 2 Democrats ever publicly on this floor anywhere say they support voter ID. Only 2 of the 47 Senate Democrats. The national media needs to ask the rest of them directly on camera, why don't you support voter ID? And when they dodge and deflect, that answer should be put out for the rest of America to see. The American people deserve to know their vote counts. They deserve to know that the person casting a ballot next to them has every right to be there. They deserve a system they can trust. Mr. President, we're going to keep fighting because the American people deserve better than the answer we got last night. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield back to the senator from Utah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my friend and colleague, the senator from Kansas, for his observations. It's often helpful to have a diagnosis of an actual medical doctor when prescribing a problem. We have an illness within our election system. Our elections have been rendered infirm, or at least very insecure, by some of these features that I've noted just a few minutes ago, including the fact that the 1993 NVRA, as passed by Congress, has been interpreted wrongly but conclusively by the Supreme Court as prohibiting the states from taking any voter registration file that comes through the NVRA, meaning an application for a driver's license made at a DMV in which the applicant checks a box and signs their name, saying, yes, I would like to also register to vote with my driver's license application. And I certify with my signature that I am, in fact, a U.S. citizen. Once that's done, there can be no further inquiry, according to the Supreme Court's incorrect but conclusive ruling in this 2013 case called Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona. And that, in short, is why we are where we are today. It's most of the reason why we need the Save America Act. It's because they said that the state cannot require, even where citizenship is believed to be lacking on the part of one or more applicants, as long as they have used the NVRA form at a DMV, the state can't do anything to follow up on it. And as I was noting a minute ago, some of these states do nothing themselves to follow up on the question of citizenship. And many of them, most of the blue states, are refusing to share data with the folks at the Department of Homeland Security who run the SAVE database, which is designed to help weed out those who have been incorrectly, fraudulently, mistakenly, or otherwise placed in a voter registration file. Again, if a state wants to allow non-citizens to vote in state elections, they may do so. And some states have allowed that in the context of some of their local elections, as has the District of Columbia. I still have no reason why they would want to do that, but they may do so if their own laws allow it, because the federal Constitution and federal law doesn't prohibit them from doing so.
Will my colleague from Utah yield for a question?
I will yield for a question.
We were just a few of us here in this chamber, but I see my colleague from Connecticut, so I'm going to ask you a question to my colleague from Utah. Would it surprise you to know that just a couple years ago, a Democrat state representative in Connecticut proposed a bill to allow all undocumented non-citizens the right to vote? And it's estimated that there's 240,000 illegal aliens in the state of Connecticut, and yet a Democrat elected official proposed that bill. Would that surprise you?
It surprises me in the sense that it seems phenomenally unwise. It would have surprised me earlier in my lifetime. It would have surprised me even earlier in my time here in the United States Senate. And yet something has happened in recent years that has eroded this long-standing, long-accepted assumption that only citizens vote in our elections. I'm not aware of any other country, certainly not any other country that any of us would want to live in, but probably not any other country that we wouldn't want to live in either, that would want to have or would allow to have non-citizens vote in their elections. Because an election isn't much of an election if anyone can vote and you don't keep track of who's voting, and you don't keep track of whether there are duplicative votes, or especially, as we're focused on here, persons voting who have no right to vote, who by voting would not only be committing a serious felony offense, but by voting would also be diluting the votes cast by lawful voters, by actual citizens of that country. There has been a trend, more in one party than the other, and you can guess which one. There's been a trend toward people saying, let's just let everyone vote, and toward thinking of a lot of things like this, like non-citizen voting in elections as something of a victimless crime, or perhaps at a minimum as sort of the required cost of doing business. Remember, I said a moment ago, our mantra has been and should continue to be, let's make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. The Democratic Party has in recent years leaned so heavily on let's make it easy to vote that they often forget, or in some cases defiantly refuse, to finish the sentence and talking about hard to cheat. Now, I understand the point. I understand that perhaps they are so enthusiastic to just make sure everyone votes that maybe they don't care that some non-citizens might vote. But I think this is very unwise, and it becomes especially untenable, especially indefensible, when we now have an estimated 30 million plus non-citizens residing in the United States, 10 to 15 million of whom entered this country illegally in between 2021 and 2025 alone. So yes, that's shocking in some ways that a Democratic lawmaker in a state not too far from where we now stand actually introduced legislation trying to open up the franchise like that. Because when you do that, that is not a victimless moment. If you were to create that, you would be diluting the votes of lawful citizens. But again, a state may do that if that state's laws and that state's constitution allow it. It would be unwise. Nonetheless, by doing that, whenever a state does that, whether for statewide state elections or just for local elections within that state, it creates a problem. It creates what I would think of as more or less a clear and present threat, one that, unless acted upon, will culminate in widespread violation of the law. As I was describing a few minutes ago, for those handful of states that have expressly allowed non-citizen voting in some of their local elections, that means that individuals have registered to vote who are not citizens. Once they have registered to vote, they are registered voters. What is to stop them from showing up and saying, I am a registered voter and I would like to vote on election day? And they receive a ballot. And the way ballots in most states work, there is a ballot that has federal elections and state elections and local elections all on the same ballot, the same document or sequence of documents. So when the questions have been asked of those jurisdictions, what, if anything, are you doing to separate out those voter registration files from those voters who are non-citizens but nonetheless allowed to vote in local elections in your state? What are you doing to prevent them from voting in federal elections? Silence has been the response. A refusal to cooperate has been the response. That, Mr. President, is chilling. All right, let's get back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. So they've been making a series of arguments against the citizenship obligations, the citizenship-related provisions of the Save America Act. And to repeat, we've made it really easy, far easier than the citizenship documentation requirements associated with new employment. If you are an American citizen and you have ever started a new job anywhere in the United States, you have had to fill out an I-9 form, and with that, you've had to comply with a very rigid, specific set of document obligations. You've had to either establish a U.S. passport, one that establishes your citizenship as an American citizen, or alternatively a U.S. birth certificate, and a government-issued photo ID or original Social Security card. And if you can't do that, you're not going to start your job unless or until you've been able to complete that. Again, we made it a lot easier, very deliberately, to comply with the Save America Act. We added lists of other documents that are widely known and recognized by the U.S. government as establishing citizenship, including a certain subcategory of driver's licenses that in some states, these enhanced driver's licenses will affirmatively establish citizenship based on the documentation that was required at the time the driver's license was received. We included those. But we also included this provision that makes it really easy for someone who has no documentation at all, is missing some documentation or even all of it. They can do so by an affidavit, by an attestation, just providing the basic details about how they became a citizen, when and where they were born, whether they were citizens at the time of their birth, and if they weren't citizens at the time of their birth, when and where and how, by what mechanism, they became naturalized citizens. From the moment you do that, you shift the burden onto the state. And it's then the state's job to go and confirm or refute what you've done. Now, if you were lying, they'll figure that out. You won't be registered, and you may end up getting in trouble for having lied under oath with that statement. I assume most people wouldn't do that. Very few would, knowing that it's a sworn statement. But if they don't conclude that it's false and conclude that it's true, would be pretty easy to confirm once you've provided the names, the dates, locations, then you will be registered to vote. No additional documents. In fact, not a single document has to be produced by you. Just that basic set of statements. Again, that begins on line 22 on page 12 of the legislation we're now debating. And yet over and over and over again, I hear from my Democratic colleagues who are arguing against this, oh, this is going to disenfranchise anyone who doesn't have a passport, as many Americans don't, and a passport costs a couple $100. And they then often make the logical leap, well, this means that you're imposing a poll tax, something that has been prohibited by the U.S. Constitution for over 60 years. And this simply is not true. There is not a poll tax. There is not a single expense. This doesn't disenfranchise anyone, even if you don't have any documents. And this is far more permissive than what you have to produce every single time you start a new job in the United States of America as a U.S. citizen. Here's another argument that is frequently being raised against the Save America Act. This is a fairly broad argument. It's a surprising argument for reasons I'm about to explain. The Democrats are waving the flag of federalism, purporting to be the champions, the newly invigorated champions of state sovereign authority, of the authority of the states within our federal system. That's what I refer to when I mean federalism. I'm referring to the 10th Amendment, to the broad concept of federalism, the idea that the federal government is, as James Madison described in Federalist Number 45, a government with powers that Madison described as few and defined. And those powers reserved to the states he described as numerous and indefinite. My Democrat colleagues, each time they bring this up, they use the same term. It's an awkward term. It's an outdated term. It's a misnomer, in my opinion. I don't like it. It's states' rights. This is a term that conjures images of George Wallace in the Deep South, the Jim Crow South. The Jim Crow policies that the Democratic Party at the time insisted upon. It was racist, oppressive, hateful policies designed to disadvantage black Americans and to exclude them from many aspects of society, public life and private life, indefensible. They would often invoke this doctrine of states' rights, which was then and remains now a misnomer, because states do not have rights. States have authority. Authority is kind of the opposite of a right. A right, in this context, is something that is a privilege, a protection against authority being misused against you. So they're kind of the yin and the yang. They are polar opposites of each other. They are not the same thing. All right, I got that out of my chest. Now let's move on to the substance of it. We'll call this federalism or state sovereign authority. They purport now to be the champions of state sovereign authority. This is really interesting. And they say that the Save America Act, this very straightforward bill that just requires proof of citizenship at the time of voter registration and photo ID at the time you cast a ballot, to prove that you are who you claim to be, the same person identified in your voter registration file. They claim that this is somehow incompatible with constitutional principles of federalism, that it's somehow unconstitutional as a federal takeover of state authority to conduct elections. Now, this argument would be laughable if it weren't so frightening and, frankly, hypocritical. Remember that in the first place, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution couldn't be clearer on this point. I don't know how any of these people could even make this argument with a straight face for this reason alone, let alone for the other reasons I'm about to identify. But Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution makes a couple things clear. First, they acknowledged wisely, I believe, that elections would be conducted by states. They didn't want to set up a federal election authority. That would be cumbersome. It'd be unnecessary. It'd be unwise. Too much consolidation of power, especially because this was always supposed to be a government of limited and enumerated powers. So they said that not only for state elections, which obviously state authorities would manage, but also for the election of federal officials, specifically election of U.S. senators and U.S. representatives, members of Congress, that their elections would also be run by state officials. They said that the legislatures of the respective states would have authority to establish the rules and regulations governing those elections, which they themselves would conduct. But my Democrat colleagues conveniently leave out the following phrase in the same provision, in Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution. That phrase being, but the Congress may at any time make or alter such regulations. Meaning those regulations, those rules and regulations governing specifically the state-run elections to choose U.S. representatives and U.S. senators. It could not be clearer. So that's all this is. We are using our authority, our very specific, very clear authority to prescribe those rules and regulations. It's not just in the abstract that this makes sense, not just in that technical, grammatical sense that we have that authority and that's what we're exercising here. This is exactly the kind of thing that should be, and I believe must be, perhaps can only be, wielded by the federal sovereign, not by state governments. Because what we're doing here is to establish citizenship. Remember, we do have the power to say this, and we have in fact enacted laws saying that only U.S. citizens may vote. To give meaning to that, to render it enforceable, we have the power to ensure that that law is being complied with. And the U.S. government is also uniquely in a position to be able to ascertain who may be a citizen and who is not a citizen. No single state is going to be able to ascertain that question, nor is U.S. citizenship itself a creature of state law as it is of federal law. It's exactly the reason why we have various government agencies that are involved in this, and that they're managed more or less through the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which, among other things, runs this database that already exists called the SAVE database. That's created for, in addition to whatever else it may cover, for this very sort of thing, so that states sharing information with the U.S. government may cross-tabulate, cross-check their voter registration files against U.S. citizenship data uniquely in the hands of the U.S. government and easily ascertain who is a citizen and who is not. That's an especially important thing to have, especially considering the fact that we had between 10 and 15 million people come into this country unlawfully just in the 4-year period alone, separate and apart from those who may have already been here. Just between 2021 and 2025, 10 to 15 million people entering this country unlawfully, and there are an estimated 30 million plus non-citizens residing in this country in almost every state, given that almost every state participates in the NVRA. In almost every state, any of those non-citizens, whether they're here legally or illegally, in light of the Supreme Court's ruling in 2013 in Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona, any one of those people in any NVR state, which is almost every state in the union, can go into a DMV, apply for a driver's license, and by checking one box and then signing their name, they may register to vote. So it's really important that we have that ability to do that. This information is uniquely in the hands of the U.S. government, which is uniquely in a position to define and manage what it means to be a citizen and keep track of who is a citizen and who is not. And yet, these blue states continue defiantly to refuse to share information. They're actively subverting our ability not only to enforce federal law, but to even know when a violation has taken place or is taking place. And so that's stunning. That's what makes it all the more indefensible for them to oppose this, and all the more laughable that they purport to be invoking the doctrine of federalism. They purport to be invoking the 10th Amendment, to be wrapping themselves in the Constitution by saying, this is an outrage. This is a federal takeover of a state function. No, it's not. It's doubly and triply not a state function. It is a distinctively, decidedly, by designation of the U.S. Constitution, a federal function. Now, for the reasons why this is not just a laughable argument, but it's also hypocritical. Just a few years ago, many of the very same Democrats who now occupy this chamber, in fact, nearly all of them, were there at the time, and every single Democrat serving in the United States during the 117th Congress, that is the Congress impaneled on January 3rd, 2021, serving through January 3rd, 2023. Remember, that was a moment when the House and the Senate and the White House were all controlled by Democrats. Every single Democrat in the United States Senate at the time, which are most of the Democrats who are still here, but every one of them that were here then, tried to pass and supported a bill designated in the 117th Congress as H.R. 1, the so-called For the People Act. Perhaps the most aggressive, intrusive, and independently, aggressively overreaching federal power grab over elections in American history. Now, that bill was not a modest reform. Unlike the Save America Act, it was not there as an exercise of our very clear and very narrow power under Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, nor was it, as the Save America Act is, a natural outgrowth of an existing federal law, the NVRA, nor was it necessitated by a quirk in the judicial interpretation of an existing federal law, the NVRA, as this is. Remember, that's the only reason we're even here. That's the only reason the Save America Act even became necessary, is because of the NVRA, an existing federal law, that itself imposes obligations on states based on the way it was later interpreted after its enactment. So, in other words, I say to my Democratic colleagues, if you are offended by the Save America Act as a supposed federal overreach, not only is that indefensible as a matter of federal constitutional law, either the plain text of the Constitution or any Supreme Court interpretation thereof, but it also presupposes that if you are opposed to this, that you also think the NVRA is itself an unconstitutional federal takeover of state election authority. Now, if you think that, then we're going to have a very different discussion. But to my knowledge, not one of them has suggested or argued that the NVRA is unconstitutional. And if it is not, there is not a chance in hell that you can make the argument that the Save America Act is unconstitutional. Not a chance. Back to the For the People Act, H.R. 1, in the 117th Congress. It was an 800-page monstrosity, a blueprint for nationalizing every meaningful aspect of how states run federal elections, that is, elections for federal office. Most importantly, elections for the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. And Democrats defended it by citing the exact same constitutional authority that they now pretend doesn't exist. That is Congress's power under the Elections Clause to set uniform rules for federal contests. Now, let's recall a little bit about what H.R. 1 actually did. I should say what it would have done had it been enacted. Mercifully for all of us, it wasn't. Let's talk about what it did. It didn't just suggest a few changes. It didn't just suggest some curative protections to existing federal legislation. Now, this is an entirely different beast, and beastly it was. It imposed binding nationwide mandates with federal court enforcement on matters of sweepingly, stunningly broad application. Among other things, it forced automatic voter registration at every government interaction, overriding state processes, overriding state law. It mandated same-day voter registration everywhere. This is a big issue because states have a broad range of when they deem it appropriate to begin or end, especially end voter registration prior to any election. Many states consider it reckless and an invitation, a recipe for voter fraud, if they allow same-day voter registration. Other states don't. That's long been considered their prerogative to decide, but this would have just decided it for the entire country. It would have required no excuse absentee voting and minimum periods of early voting, no matter what state law said. If some states wanted, and previously had always had much more limited pre-election day voting periods, or none at all, it wouldn't matter. It completely eviscerated their authority to make such decisions. It would have stripped state legislatures of their traditional role, not just their traditional role, but their constitutional role, a role acknowledged in the U.S. Constitution itself and in the respective state constitutions in drawing legislative district maps, specifically those mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, the congressional maps. And it would have done that by forcing these so-called independent redistricting commissions, taking away the authority that has always belonged to the states and to the state legislatures, as the Constitution has designed, as the Constitution contemplates and ordains, and force them to adopt these independent redistricting commissions, whether they wanted to or not. It would have severely restricted how states could maintain accurate voter rolls, banning removals based solely on failure to vote, limiting interstate cross-checks, and imposing cumbersome notice requirements before any cleanup of voter registration files. As if that weren't enough of an insult to federalism, to state sovereign authority, to good government, local self-rule, or any of the other things that we hold dear in our constitutional system, H.R. 1 went even further than that. It would have legalized unlimited ballot harvesting by third parties. It would have barred states from requiring witness signatures or notarization on mail-in ballots and forced them to count ballots received up to 10 days after Election Day. Now, any one of those things in isolation is a powder keg. It's a huge, huge policy decision. Efforts to change anything like that in state law, in any state legislature, would end up being a very significant debate. But this just bulldozed all of it. Particularly when it comes to ballot harvesting, this is troubling. Ballot harvesting, when coupled with the existence of widespread, universal, mail-in ballots, allows for a special kind of mischief, which fortunately is thwarted in many states, like my own, that prohibit ballot harvesting. Where it exists, it causes a massive risk of voter fraud, and yet this would have prohibited the states from banning it, every state. It would have weakened voter ID laws by allowing sworn statements in lieu of actual identification, even if state law would itself have required something more. It would have overridden state felony disenfranchisement rules, gotten rid of bans imposed by states on people voting based on a felony conviction. That, too, has long been considered the unique province of the states. This bulldozed over that, and they would have mandated out-of-precinct ballot counting, pre-registered 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, dictated rigid redistricting criteria, banned mid-decade map drawing, and imposed federal standards for polling equipment, drop boxes, curbside voting, and much, much more. State election officials were even subjected to new federal restrictions themselves. There were also provisions in there that, as I recall, would have forced every jurisdiction, every voting jurisdiction, every precinct, local, statewide, or otherwise, to become the effective equivalent of a Section 5 pre-clearance jurisdiction. Let me explain what that means. Under the Voting Rights Act, there are a limited number of voting jurisdictions in the United States with a history of racial discrimination. Those states under the Voting Rights Act, or those jurisdictions, once they were deemed to have engaged in this, they had to subject changes to their legislative districts to some pre-clearance requirements, meaning before they could take effect, some federal officials would have to approve them. This would have taken every jurisdiction of the United States, and the North and the South and the East and the West, regardless of whether they had any tradition, any history at all of any kind of racial or other discrimination, and said, all of you, before you make any changes to your voting rules, to your district boundaries, whatever, you've got to come to Washington, D.C. and receive a Mother May I permission slip from Uncle Sam. These, Mr. President, were not just incentives. These, Mr. President, were not just slight modifications. These were commands, steamrolling over policies that have long been deemed the province of the states. Now, Democrats, every Democrat in the United States Senate at the time justified every one of them by arguing that Congress could, quote, provide a complete code for congressional elections, close quote, superseding state law. And they were right in one respect, that at least one provision of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, gives Congress some power, but they were dead wrong about the wisdom, the legality, the constitutionality of using legislative reforms like that one to turn states and localities into nothing more than administrative subdivisions of the federal government, subject entirely to the will and the whim of the federal sovereign. Compared to all of that, the Save America Act is the precise opposite of that kind of overreach. It doesn't touch early voting. It doesn't touch ballot deadlines, redistricting, campaign finance. Doesn't render any district subject. It doesn't make any voting district or precinct or state, much less all of them, a pre-clearance jurisdiction. It doesn't force states to adopt same-day voter registration or independent redistricting commissions, contrary to state constitutions and the U.S. Constitution. It simply enforces what has been federal law for decades. Most importantly, a federal law that's been on the book for decades that says that only U.S. citizens may vote in federal elections. And requires basic documentary proof of citizenship at the time of registration with reasonable, very flexible, affordable, and in fact free alternatives to those documentary requirements, and a photo ID at the polls. The bare minimum common sense demands that we make after years of open borders. It even helps states clean up their roles by directing data sharing with the Department of Homeland Security. If Congress could constitutionally force every state to count out-of-precinct ballots and legalize unlimited ballot harvesting under H.R. 1. It can certainly require proof that voters are actually Americans. Now, of course, it can't do the former. H.R. 1 was blatantly unconstitutional for a whole host of reasons, not to mention its many policy defects. But my point is this: every Democrat in the United States Senate saw no problem at all with the constitutionality of H.R. 1. This is the equivalent of straining at a gnat while swallowing a camel. In fact, that comparison is almost an understatement. The difference isn't just in the magnitude, it isn't just constitutional, it's also political. Democrats cheered federal preemption when it was sweeping, when it expanded, and in their view, when it expanded access, and in their view, as they saw it, their voter base, when they saw it as consistent with their own political interests, when they saw it as a chance to secure significant gains in elections. They scream federalism, or as they put it, states' rights. The moment the focus shifts to election eligibility and integrity, and they scream it even where, as here, this is plainly well within what the federal government is authorized to do, and plainly within the same statutory context that already exists, that has existed for decades, and that not one of my Democrat colleagues has called on us to repeal. If the Save America Act is somehow unconstitutional as a federal overreach, then the NVRA is a far worse infraction, and yet you don't hear them saying that because it's not true. This is selective federalism of the very worst kind. The same crowd that tried to nationalize American elections, truly nationalize them, is now engaging in this aggressive pearl-clutching exercise about state authority the instant we try to stop non-citizens from diluting the votes of actual citizens. And make no mistake, Mr. President, that is what's happening. That is what happens every time a non-citizen casts a vote. This is not a victimless crime. This is not a harmless infraction. This is not the voting equivalent of removing, however recklessly and wantonly and willfully, the do not remove tags from a mattress. Same crowd that tried to nationalize American elections is now engaging in this awful pearl clutching about state authority the instant, the second, the millisecond we try to stop non-citizens from diluting the votes of actual American citizens. And the American people aren't buying this, nor should they. Look, the Constitution does not recognize any political parties. And not only that, it certainly doesn't allow one party to federalize elections when it happens to help them, and then invoke federalism as a shield when they're about to be held accountable, when people are about to be held accountable, when state officials are about to be held accountable for facilitating the wanton violation of federal law. So no, Mr. President, the Save America Act does not violate federalism. It vindicates the sovereign authority of the American people, the true sovereigns in our system, to choose their own government. And it does so with far more restraint than Democrats ever showed when the shoe was on the other foot, when they were pushing an 800-page monstrosity that was itself an indefensible federal takeover of state authority. So Congress should pass the Save America Act without apology. This hypocrisy has gone on long enough. The constitutional arguments here do not hold water, not at all, not for an instant. You know, it's interesting that as we stand here today, the Department of Homeland Security has gone unfunded, thanks to Senate Democrats for over a month. They've been going without pay. How tragic that is, that these individuals who are working hard are having to work hard. And they're not wealthy people. You think of everyone from TSA agents to ICE agents, everybody else in the Department of Homeland Security continuing to have to work. These are not wealthy people. And there are so many of them who, in addition to not being paid, still have to work and have to work doing really hard jobs, sometimes risky jobs. This is not fair. What's the parallel between the two? Well, I find it interesting that the same department that's now been unfunded is the same department that, among other things, oversees the SAVE database and the offices, the agencies within the Department of Homeland Security that exist to help ensure election integrity and security, that are there to help states to review their voter registration files and identify those who are not citizens and thus shouldn't be voting. Those same offices, those same personnel themselves remain defunded. During this discussion this afternoon, the senator from Maryland was speaking about some of these incidents. Even though these things appear to be unrelated, on the one hand, the Save America Act and its merits, which we've been debating, and on the other hand, funding for the Department of Homeland Security, I sometimes think that they're not very unrelated at all, especially because they're defunding the very entity that could and otherwise would and should, and if we were able to enact the Save America Act, ultimately would help protect our elections, to make sure that they are secure, to make sure that they are free from foreign election interference, which is exactly what happens when we allow foreign nationals, not citizens of the United States, to vote in our elections. She referred to ICE agents, to ICE as a whole, as a quote-unquote goon squad. She accused ICE of being out there deployed and quote-unquote killing people. This is sad. This is tragic. Now, keep in mind, there are about 22,000 ICE agents. A subset of those, about 6,000 of them, are responsible for apprehending and removing those removable illegal aliens that are in the country. So about 6,000 out of the 22,000. Then it's a much smaller subset of the 6,000 that she might be referring to when she accuses ICE, a much broader agency, of quote-unquote killing people and being a goon squad. How many of those people were actually involved in any of the activity that she's complained about? I don't know the answer, but it's not 6,000. It sure as hell isn't 22,000. And it sure as hell isn't 260,000. That's the total number of employees going unpaid within the Department of Homeland Security. So this is collective punishment at its worst, at its most indefensible. She and her Democrat colleagues stand here today, continue over a month into this shutdown, not concerned, blaming the collective for what she's complaining about with just a few, before investigations are even complete and before we know where, when, to what extent wrongdoing on the part of any agents might have been involved. This is wrong, Mr. President. It's not just wrong, but I sometimes wonder, is this in fact a willful attempt to subvert the enforcement of our laws, not just our immigration laws, but also our laws that govern our elections, that protect our elections from foreign election interference? As they say in Latin, Res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. Mr. President, before I wrap up, I want to thank our Republican leadership in the Senate. I want to thank my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Wyoming, who serves as the Republican whip. And I want to thank my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from South Dakota, the majority leader, Senator John Thune, for their leadership. I want to thank them for keeping us here through this weekend, to keep us debating these matters. We have no business going home, not for a weekend, not for a recess. We have no business going home until this is done. We've got to get DHS funded. We've got to get the Save America Act passed. And yes, they are related. For the very same reason we need one, we also need the other. And for this very same reason that they oppose one, they oppose the other. But the fact is, Mr. President, the American people are not with them, they are with us. The American people understand that it's not fair to punish the collective for what may or may not be the wrongdoing of just a few. The American people understand that it is not an act of aggression, certainly not an unconstitutional overreach, certainly not an egregious abuse of power, or anything other than common sense to require people who vote in U.S. elections to be American citizens. And to end this barbaric practice to which we've been subjected for far too long, and which we're told, yeah, it's illegal for non-citizens to vote, but you can't do anything about it. They've rendered it unenforceable. We're trying to fix that with a narrowly tailored piece of legislation. Now, if one of them, even one of them, wants to talk about changes that we could make that would make them feel better about it, I'm all ears. I've been listening to that for 3 days now, and longer than that before we got on. But since we got onto this bill about 3 days ago, I've been listening especially attentively for anyone to make a constructive suggestion from the other side, or even an argument that is itself defensible in light of what the Save America Act actually does, in light of what federal law actually says, and in light of what the U.S. Constitution actually allows, authorizes, and says. And I have yet to hear it. Sometimes I wonder, Mr. President, what it is that they actually want. Do they actually want our borders to remain open as they were between 2021 and 2025? Do they, beyond this, actually want non-citizens to continue to be able to vote? Even when we know that in some states they're openly allowing or even inviting non-citizens to participate in some local elections. Even when they know that there are thousands upon thousands of non-citizen registered voters that have been detected just in the small handful of states that have on their own undertaken a review to see who is registered. They've found thousands, and that process is far from complete yet. How many more are there? And how long are the American people to be expected to suffer through a system that invites, allows, and perpetuate forces that will undeniably diluting, ultimately deprive them of one of their most sacred rights, the right to vote? Finally, Mr. President, when we talk about constitutional protections of rights, my colleagues say again and again and again that because the right to vote is constitutionally protected, and it is, by multiple amendments in multiple ways by the Constitution, that somehow means that you can't put any reasonable restrictions on it. Well, that's not true. That's never been true. We do have restrictions on them all the time. We also have restrictions on a lot of other constitutionally protected rights, and that doesn't mean that you don't have to prove who you are and that you have the right to do the thing that you want to be able to do. We already have to prove our citizenship every time we start a new job with a set of documents, document requirements that are far more strict than those are here. We already have to divulge all kinds of information that's far more intrusive than anything required here. And in fact, on the subject of specifically constitutionally protected rights, the right to bear arms, you know what you have to do when you want to buy a gun through a federally licensed firearms dealer? You have to provide ID, and you have to show that you are who you say you are. Then they run it through a database to make sure that in addition to being who you say you are, that you also have the right to exercise the constitutionally protected right that you want to exercise by buying that gun. It's the same exact thing. It is also a constitutionally protected right, and yet we allow it. Why? Well, because we have laws, and those laws decide how that right may be exercised, and we ban certain persons from wielding that right. For example, if you're an alien, illegally or unlawfully present in the United States, or you're a convicted felon, or you fit any of the other categories, in 18 U.S.C. section 922G, you're not allowed to purchase, possess, use, or probably even think about a gun. You'll be prohibited from doing so. They're apparently okay with that. If they're okay with that, and that's a constitutionally protected right, why aren't they okay with this? When somebody else exercises that right, they're undermining your vote, my vote, the vote of every American citizen. We cannot allow that to happen. I will continue to come back to the Senate chamber every day, day after day, week after week, month after month, if that's what it takes to get this thing passed. But it will pass. We will not stop until it does. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
Majority Whip.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 12 noon on Saturday, March 21st, that following the prayer and the pledge, the general proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate resume the House message with respect to S. 1383.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, for the information of my colleagues, we expect 2 votes at approximately 1 p.m. tomorrow. If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 12 noon tomorrow.